welcome to Humanities on the Road. Today we are at the Oosterhout Free Library in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania for The Revolution of Nancy Drew with Michael Cornelius. And I'm Tracy Matisak. You know, Humanities on the Road is a collaboration between the Pennsylvania Humanities Council and the Pennsylvania Cable Network, and the goal is to bring together people from all across Pennsylvania to talk about history and the arts and the important ideas that shape our world. We want to extend special thanks to our host, the Oosterhout Free Library. You know, this library opened its doors in 1889 and has been serving the residents of Luzerne County continuously ever since. In fact, last year, this library circulated more than 228,000 items, answered something like 58,000 questions, and hosted, get this, more than 1,000 programs for children and adults just in the course of a year. So it should be no surprise that last year alone, more than 234,000 people visited this library. Now, while most library users take advantage of the traditional services, it seems that more and more people are taking advantage of the public internet computers that are here. They are attending electronic gaming events and enjoying free access to online databases. And what the library is really trying to do is striving to bring together the diverse segments of the community by offering programs for all ages. So for instance, whether it's story time for preschoolers or open mic night for teenagers or computer and technology classes for seniors, the Oosterhout Free Library is a true community center. Let me tell you a little bit about our speaker today. Michael Cornelius is a Commonwealth speaker with the Pennsylvania Humanities Council. He is the chair of the Department of English and Mass Communications at Wilson College in Chambersburg. Michael started reading Nancy Drew books when he was 9 years old, and he has studied and published on the role of the girl sleuth in popular culture for many years now. Michael is also a published writer of thrillers, speculative fiction that he calls mysteries with monsters. Michael is going to talk, of course, about the most famous girl sleuth of all time. And you know, 2010 marks the 80th anniversary of the publication of the very first Nancy Drew books. So the first half of our program will talk about the origin of the character, and then the second half will talk about the influence of Nancy Drew on popular culture. Michael will answer our questions, and of course our audience will share their Nancy Drew memories and stories as well. So with all that said, please join me and give Michael Cornelius a warm welcome.
80 years ago, America was firm in the grip of a depression that would prove to be the toughest economic crisis this country has ever faced. The nation faced difficulties on numerous fronts: economic, military, social, environmental. Sounds kind of familiar, actually. But from all this trouble, a hero emerged, or in this case, a heroine. A spunky, a smart, dare I say perfect, 16-year-old attorney's daughter from middle America who, with a combination of brains, pluck, determination, and a really financially strong father, went on to become the greatest girl sleuth of all time and one of the most enduring and significant literary creations ever in the history of the world. Okay, that's a little prosaic and a little indulgent. But I think we can afford to be a little indulgent when we talk about Nancy Drew. As of 2010, in her 80th year, she has been the star of 12 different series, not counting standalone books. She's been featured in movies, books, comics, video games, television shows, cereal boxes. That's not bad. By best estimate, well over 100 million Nancy Drew books have been sold in the United States alone, and the number may be much higher than that. She has solved over 500 distinct mysteries, which is more than Sherlock Holmes, Hercule Poirot, Miss Marple, Peter Wimsey, and James Bond combined. Take that, you adult sleuths. And she did it all without ever messing up her perfectly appointed coif. But who is Nancy Drew? Where did she come from? And why 80 years later are we still talking about her? So let's look at that, the evolution of this character in this segment of my talk. I have some bad news for someone. There is no Carolyn Keene. Every time I talk about Nancy Drew, I have to tell people Carolyn Keene is not a real person. And somebody seems to imagine that even 80 years later, Carolyn Keene is still somewhere in a nursing home churning out Nancy Drew book after Nancy Drew book after Nancy Drew book. That's not the case, although here are some of the books that are connected to her. In fact, Nancy Drew was conceived by a man, Edward Stratemeyer, famous American author, and in many ways really the inventor of the 20th century children's series. They had them in the 19th century, but he created a whole new way of doing it. Stratemeyer was born in New Jersey in 1862, and he came to his calling as a writer pretty early in life. He wrote and created some very famous series, which we'll talk about those in a minute, but his first was called The Rover Boys, which was at the turn of the last century. And he even wrote 11 books as Horatio Alger. When the author, the famous author, was ill, and towards the end of his life, he turned to Stratemeyer to continue writing under his own name. Not a bad deal if you can get that. Stratemeyer, though, is probably most famous and most renowned for founding the Stratemeyer Syndicate. And this is his real genius. The Syndicate is a book packager. We still have those today, but most people don't know what they do. Here's how it worked. A member of the Syndicate company, usually Stratemeyer himself, would write a detailed 3-page outline of a book. And this is how Nancy Drew was born. The outline would then be sent to a ghostwriter, who would be the author who would actually write the book based on these outlines. And if you wondered, yes, these outlines still exist for Nancy Drew. They still are around. The Stratemeyer Syndicate had excellent archives. The books were then edited by the Syndicate, and the books as an entire package were then sold to the publisher. So while Grosset and Dunlap was the company responsible for publishing the early Nancy Drew books, the Syndicate was the company that created them. And Grosset and Dunlap's main job was just to distribute those books themselves. And the Stratemeyer Syndicate had its hands and fingers on most of the famous children's series in the early first half of the 20th century. And here are just a few you can see. Hardy Boys, Tom Swift, the Dana Girls, Ruth Fielding, the Bobbsey Twins. The list goes on and on and on. Now, Edward did conceive of Nancy Drew, but he died in 1930, right after the first 3 books were released. And his 2 daughters, Harriet and Edna, eventually took over the company for him. And it was Harriet that ran the company for most of her life until the mid-'80s. She was an incredible woman of business and a very formidable presence, though some fans and scholars have questioned that some of the books that she herself actually created the outlines for some of the odder of the Nancy Drew series. So she had some really wonderful talents. Plotting might not have been amongst them, but that's okay. You may recognize this. This is a very famous silhouette of a Stratemeyer character known as Stella Strong. Wait, Stella Strong? No. Actually, that's not true. This is the famous Nancy Drew silhouette from the books that were published in the 30s and the 40s. Move over here a little bit. But Nancy's original name was actually Stella Strong when the Syndicate actually got together and said, we need to create a particular female sleuth and a solo series character. What are we going to name her? The first name was Stella Strong. She was also called Diana Dare, Nan Nelson, Helen Hale, and Nellie Fay. Apparently alliteration was dropped at some point. And she was ghostwritten by Clara May Rosemont or Louise Keene, not Carolyn Keene. So there was an actual process to creating Nancy Drew. She did not spring fully formed from Edward Stratemeyer's mind. There's many hands involved in this actual character. Nancy was one of the very first female solo series. Most female series prior to 1930 featured groups of girls, like the Blythe Girls series, which was around the same time, and they had many others. Not all of them. Certainly Ruth Fielding was a pioneer in that area. But Nancy was the first girl sleuth series. There was no girl sleuth series prior to Nancy Drew. And every girl sleuth series since Nancy Drew is a reaction of or a redaction to Nancy. Either they sort of copy her and take her best qualities, or they respond to Nancy and say, well, I'm not so sure about some of these qualities, let me create someone different. But without Nancy Drew, we wouldn't have Judy Bolton, the Dana Girls, Trixie Belden, and so many others. Another interesting note, A lot of people think that Nancy Drew was actually created because the Hardy Boys were so popular. The Hardy Boys came out in 1927, and most people assume that the two series, since they are the most popular series the Syndicate created, went hand in hand. That in fact the Hardy Boys were such big sellers that Nancy Drew was created as a copy. I'm not sure I agree that Nancy Drew copies the Hardy Boys. In fact, I think they're very different, and maybe we can talk about that a little later. But interestingly, the Hardy Boys were not the best-selling series at the time for the Stratemeyer Syndicate. There were many other series that were doing much better than the Hardy Boys. One example is the Ted Scott series, which was a boys flying series. So one would imagine that Stratemeyer would have created a girl flying series, which eventually the Syndicate did. But no, somehow Edward Stratemeyer had the presence of mind and the foresight to realize what was needed at that time was a girl sleuth. Well, the man was a genius for a reason. This is Mildred Wirt Benson, a very important name in Nancy Drew lore. Once Stratemeyer and the Syndicate had the concept down and had the outline put together, they needed somebody to write the series. And they turned to Mildred Wirt Benson, who was an amazing pioneer in her own right. She was born in Iowa in 1905 and was a really apt person to pen Nancy Drew. She was the first woman to get a master's in journalism from the University of Iowa. She was a pilot. She toured the United States extensively at the time. Just an incredibly adventurous spirit, which you can see that she poured into the series herself. She had written for the Syndicate prior to this, writing books in the Ruth Fielding series, and later she would write Penny Parker books, the Dana Girls, and many others, over 100 books in all. But she wrote, and is most well known for, her work with Nancy Drew. She wrote the first 7 Nancy Drew books and did 23 Nancy Drew titles overall. And there have been many, many other ghosts who have contributed to the Nancy Drew canon since then. I still haven't been asked to do one myself. Maybe this television show can help, I'm not sure. Interestingly, for writing Secret of the Old Clock, Mildred Benson got $125, flat fee. That's it. For a book that sold millions of copies. But that's how they worked back in the day. And Benson herself, to her credit, never complained. She thought it was a fair price for what she did, and then never looked back, always looked forward. Here is the cover of Secret of the Old Clock, the first book that introduced Nancy Drew to the world, a very famous, iconic figure. The Nancy in this book may be a little different than the Nancy Drew you remember. First of all, she's 16 years old, a very appropriate age for an individual on the cusp of womanhood in 1930. She's blonde, which may come as a surprise to you. We'll talk about how some of these changed in a minute. Her mother died 6 years prior to the opening of the book, so when Nancy was 10 years old. Nancy runs the household. She's very much a figure in charge of her home. She's very much a domestic figure that way. Mrs. Gruen is her housekeeper, and she calls Nancy Miss Nancy every time. Her best friend is Helen Corning, but Helen isn't around very much, and she doesn't really have a boyfriend. Nancy's a bit of a loner, but really she's much more of an individual and sort of a singular figure doing her own thing. And while I'm talking about these, let's just run through some of the formats really quickly in case you're wondering about the books you have at home. This is called the white spine format because of the color of the book spine. These books had 25 chapters and beautiful covers done by Russell Tandy, most of them. They had glossy internals early on, so if you have a book with the glossy internal pictures, that's one of the earlier ones, mostly from the 30s. This design lasted until 1945, and you can see the familiar orange and blue. Orange and blue are Nancy Drew's colors. And books number 1 through 22 came out in this format. The next format, a little later on, was the wrap format. This began with the 23rd book in this series, The Tolling Bell. Here's an example of the 9th book in this series, Sign of the Twisted Candles. They were also illustrated, but the internal illustrations were not glossy. They were the same length, and some of the earlier books were reissued, so collectors have to have one of each when they collect. And this format lasted until 1962. This may be familiar for anyone